Hi, I'm David.
Hi, I'm Yelena.
Welcome to our tutorial on happy wrists. Happy wrists in asana practice.
It's very specific.
Oh yeah. I mean, I hope your wrists are happy all the time, but sometimes they get unhappy when you're doing yoga practice. Anyway, this is really valuable information. I'm sure you know that. That's why you're here, right? So make sure to let us know that you like it. And please let us know if you want to see something else. Give us a comment. Give us a follow. I can never remember which side it's on. It's on that side. Okay? And share it. Share it with someone else that you know has wrists. Okay? All right. So what's the deal with wrists? Well, they often start to hurt because we're putting a lot of pressure on them, and the pressure isn't always even, right? So basically, we need to figure out how to keep the pressure on the wrists even as we go through all these crazy movements that our practice requires us to do. I would say there's two places that are the most common for wrist pain. One is in Chaturanga Dandasana, which is four-limb staff pose, that push-up position that people do in the vinyasa sequence. And then the other one would be upward facing dog. Yeah?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, which is, when the shoulders are extended, and we'll see what happens there with the wrists.
Or I guess at some point it just starts to hurt all the time.
Yeah, once it starts to hurt, then it starts to hurt all the time. So I should say causes, right? Yeah. Yeah. So let's look at the Chaturanga Dandasana one first, okay? Chaturanga Dandasana is tricky because your wrists start to hurt because other parts of your body aren't keeping up, basically. So the way that we would want to do Chaturanga Dandasana ideally is with the elbows over the wrists as we lower down, which means that the torso comes parallel to the floor, with the arms, the upper arms, basically coming forward of the elbows. So very hard to do. Yeah. What happens a lot of the time is because that's so challenging, people end up bringing the elbows too far back or out to the sides and off the line of the wrists. And what happens then is that the inside edge of the palm lifts, which you can see on Yelena's hands. They're we call it tenting. I call it tenting. The inside of the palm lifts away from the floor. So the weight isn't even on the hands, but that also means the weight isn't even on the wrists.
And that also happens because we start to cheat. We start to get really exhausted by all the Chaturanga Dandasana, or maybe we still have to build strength to do it properly. So often we see students doing this thing where they catch the sides of their ribs and they kind of squeeze it, and then the rest.
Yeah, they rest their body on the elbows.
Weight.
Yeah.
And what that does, it brings you off all of these lines that David was mentioning, and it also doesn't help in building the strength.
Yeah. So you can see it's a simple rule, basically. It is that you need to keep the elbow over the wrist, but it's not easy to do. It's very difficult. Of course, you might want to do that, but what happens when you can't? What happens when you're feeling too weak or your wrists are already hurting? Maybe they're already sensitive. Well, first you need to make sure that your lines are good. So even if we're going to modify in other places, we still want to make sure that the elbows are going to stay over the wrist and that the hands stay flat on the floor. And let's define what that means. That means the index knuckles of the hands, so all of those knuckles there, are pressing down into the mat, but the fingers might kind of lift a little bit off the floor. The fingertips press down, the tip of the thumb presses down, maybe the fingers lift, but the hand stays flat, or at least the knuckles of the hand. You might even feel like the inside of your palm lifts a little bit away from the floor, creates a little suction,
yeah.
Sometimes like a little farting sound. But we know it's just your hand, for sure. Okay. And once you have that line, okay, then you might want to put your knees onto the floor to mitigate the weight in the upper body, to make it a bit easier to hold that alignment. So the knees can be down, and then you're going to have to be really intentional, conscientious about tracking the elbows over the wrist, which means the shoulders have to come forward. I know it's so hard, even with the elbows down. Don't let the elbows come back. Make sure the index knuckles stay connected to the mat and then come down. Even this is going to be super hard if you're not used to doing it. So you might just want to come all the way down, right onto your chest. And then from there, elbows are still over the wrist, so you're in a good spot. You could come into your upward facing dog. There's nothing wrong with coming all the way down onto the stomach. That's totally fine. You're going through the entire range of motion. That's going to build strength. You're going to keep your wrists safe because the elbows are stacked over them. Everything is fine with that. And then over time, you'll be able to keep the chest off the floor.
And you might even find yourself that you can kind of control descent for a little bit, and then there's no more control, even with the knees down on the floor. Again, I know David just said it, but just let yourself then do like a gentle belly flop. It's much, much better than kind of staying really high up thinking that that's somehow going to be healthier for the wrist and the shoulder and overall mobility.
Okay. And then kind of moving from that. So basically we're saying elbows over the wrist, palms flat. And we're going to carry that forward now into upward facing dog. And here is another place very common for wrist pain to show up because people are coming too far forward with the shoulders. Okay. So we want to make sure that this line here doesn't happen where the shoulder comes too far past the wrist and you get too much extension in the wrist and you're collapsing in the front. So it'll either show up with kind of like pulling in the back of the wrist here, or you're going to feel like sharp compression pain in the front of the wrist. Very common. And the solution is to keep the shoulders, again, in line, and elbows in line with the wrists. But the way that you do it is a little bit different. It has to do with the feet this time, right? Because our back bend, well, maybe it's directional too. When we come up into our back bend and we're straightening the arms up, if our feet are too close to the hands and the back doesn't accommodate the extension, then we're going to be pushed forward onto the hands like that, and that's where the wrists will take it. So between Chaturanga and upward facing dog, you might have to create some room between the hands and the feet by sliding back on the feet before you come into upward facing dog. And then you got a perfect line here. And just like we were saying before, eventually you can get rid of that extra movement or that accommodation when the body starts to open up a bit, but you can't really stress your wrists while you're waiting for that to happen.
And then also just pay attention to the way your fingers are being placed on the floor. We want the fingers to be apart, but that doesn't mean that you stretch them out as much as you can. Place the hands on the floor and then just gently open up your fingers so that you can feel that you can find some resistance by pushing the fingertips into the floor without stressing them out by opening them as wide as possible. So somewhere there, you play with it and you figure out what feels best for you.
And we've mentioned this in other tutorials too, but when you're doing something like upward facing dog, again, it's not only the shoulder coming past the wrist, but we also have to make sure there that we're keeping the palm, the index knuckles flat on the floor. So it's a slightly different action, but make sure the arms stay slightly internally rotated in upward facing dog as you're pulling through. Don't let yourself roll onto the outsides of the wrists or the hands and lift the index knuckles. You know what I mean? By rolling the arms out to open up the chest and retracting the scapula. Keep the scapula protracted with inward rotation, connect through the index knuckles, and then use the strength of the arms to pull the chest through. That's a lot of information, but if you listen to it again, it's correct. Okay. So, happy wrists. It's possible. Your wrists don't have to hurt. They shouldn't hurt when you're doing a practice. If it's a persistent pain and you can't escape it, even with this alignment tune-up, then you need to go check it out with a health professional. I've always found acupuncture really useful for stuff like that with wrist pain. Yeah, I've had it and figured it out through alignment and through getting treatment and stuff. So if you have it, you can get past it too, hopefully.
And then if you are going through wrist pain too, that might mean that you have to scale back a little bit in your practice, modify, and just let it heal, because even though now you have the technique, we've given you the information, applying it isn't gonna solve the problem right away because there's just too much soreness and inflammation there. So that just takes time for it to calm down and then slowly reapproach it. So really practice mindfulness.
Okay, I hope you like this tutorial.
Give us a like, subscribe, share, and of course, please comment letting us know what we should do next.